Well, right off the bat, let me say Happy New Year to everybody. Thank you for being a patron, and I hope that this new year is good to you. I hope it's good to me. I hope it's good to all of us. I'm actually recording this on December 4th, but this won't be released until I think it's January 4th, the first Tuesday in January, whatever that is. So I'm coming to you from the past, speaking to you in the future. So anyway, I hope you had a great Christmas, great New Year's. If all went well, we should be returned from our visit to our son and daughter-in-law's house and seeing my grandsons and also seeing my wife's parents. So as I watch this, I hope you had a good time, John. Anyway, Happy New Year, everybody. Now, what the actual point of this video is to talk about wet palettes a little bit. I've used them on and off on projects over the years, and I believe in them. I mean, I don't argue that wet palettes are useful. Now, quite often the reason I don't use them, the reason I generally stick with my dry palette quite often is because many times I'm just painting a single color. I just need it thinned a little bit and I paint it. And then when I'm done, I move on to the next one. And because I generally don't use mixes very often, I don't need it on the palette so I can come back to it the next day or 2 days later or whatever. And if there is a mix that I need, I usually mix it in a bottle because I'm going to need a lot of it. So it's something that I have used. I understand how to use it, but I've never used it to a great extent. So for this project, I decided, okay, I'm going to just stick to using a wet palette. And I've done that for pretty much 90% of the project so far. Now, if you'll pardon the shaky cam for a moment, I'm just going to pan around here by hand. These are all the paints I've used on Gaunt's Ghosts. Everything you see in this area has in some way or another been used on these models. So I had a lot of paints going on. Now, at the start of the project, I used this Army Painter wet palette, and you can see that the sponge is dry. This thing is about almost 8 inches this way and 5 inches this way. So it's 8 by 5 inches. And because I haven't used them for a large painting project in the past, I thought, okay, this should work fine. And I started using it, and it worked generally well. The sponge has gotten a little mildewy, but it's a great sponge. It works really well. The papers that come with it, as far as keeping the paints moist, I've read some complaints about the papers, but they worked okay for me. What didn't work okay for me was that if I take this dry paper out and put it in here, it fits perfectly. It's exactly the same size as the interior dimensions of this thing. But what I found out is when this paper gets wet, it expands. And what I started having to do was essentially cut about 1/4 of an inch all the way around so that it didn't end up folding up on the sides, which, you know, it got to be a little bit of a pain. But more importantly, as I started working with all of those paints, the wet palette just very quickly, you know, the idea is you have all your mixes and all your paints there, and you can close it up and you put it in the refrigerator or whatever you do and come back in the next day, they're all still there. I got done with the end of a session, and when I got to the next session, I needed a whole new bunch of paints, and there was no more room on it. So while this wet palette works good, and I could see myself, I'm not going to get rid of it, I could see myself using this for smaller projects, it wasn't really useful for what a wet palette is supposed to do, which is allow you to have the colors you're working with on one area and just pick and choose from them as you need. Now, pretty quickly as I got into the project, I went with the Marco Frazzoni, I think that's the guy's name, a mini painter on YouTube. His method involves eating a box of chocolates, which right out of the bat, you know, he says in his video, it's a great video. In his video, he says something, you know, step 1, eat all the chocolates. It's always good when that's one of the steps involved in it. And this is a much bigger box to use. It's a little over 8 inches square, so there's plenty of surface space. It's much bigger than the Army Painter box. It's hard to get the whole chocolate box on camera, and you can see it's almost twice as big as the Army Painter box. So it's great for that, and it's not real tall when you take the lid off. It's low, so it's easy to get to. You're not having to go down into something, so it works really well that way. What I did not like about this was he suggested using something called Swedish paper towels. Now, I don't know if that's one of those products that, we call it like, French fries. Apparently, French fries aren't actually from France. Swedish dishcloths. I don't know if these are actually from Sweden. I mean, it says made in Europe, but I don't know if, someone from Sweden would go, yes, we use those all the time. Or if that's just the name that they put on it. But I use some of these, and I cut it, and I put water on it, I put it in there, and I put a piece of parchment paper over it, which is what he recommends. But the problem was every type of Swedish dishcloth that I've found has some sort of texture on it. And when these things get wet and everything's expanded out, it means that the parchment paper only touched the sponge along the texture. And so I had these huge areas where there was no contact and thus no water transfer. And that just didn't work. And I didn't want to keep trying to buy brand after brand after brand of this stuff to find something that works. So I went with the packing foam that I use for sponge chipping. Now this worked really well when I put my parchment paper down on it in terms of contact, but it's so thick, it took a load of water to keep this thing hydrated. And I mean, it would just literally sit there and slosh around in it. If I hit it too hard, it would slosh water over. So it worked well, and I used it for most of the project, although the last day or two, I've just said, forget it. I'm going back to this guy because I know he works. But I finally decided I'm going to take the advice of quite a few miniature painters that I've seen in YouTube videos, that they compare all of these, and they usually come away and say, okay, there's a big one from Redgrass Games that's really good, but it's $60. And then they say, but there's one from a company called Masterson that's like on Amazon. It's like $13. And it's a little wider than this box of chocolate things, but not quite as deep. So the surface space is about the same. And it comes with a sponge that they say works really well, and some papers with it that, depending on who you ask, they work good or they don't work good, but they work. And it's cheaper. So I'm going to try that one because I like using the wet palette, but I realized I need more surface. But if I could have found a better sponge or a better solution for this to hold water, if I could have found some of those Swedish paper towels that were completely smooth, I would have stuck with this. Although probably I would have accidentally broken the box every few weeks and thus would have needed to get some more chocolates. But that's another story. But anyway, that's been my adventures with wet palettes. If you haven't used one, give it a try. Watch some videos on YouTube about how to use them. Give them a try. If you already are a mini painter, you know the benefit. But like I said, there's still a use for the dry palette. Don't throw this away if you get a wet palette. They both have their uses, but that's been kind of my adventure with wet palettes as I go through this project.